The night I decided to leave my husband wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming, no thrown objects, no final argument. It was quiet. I stood in our bedroom doorway, holding a suitcase I hadn't packed yet, listening to the low hum of the air conditioner. My husband was in the shower, humming softly, completely unaware that I was mentally dismantling our entire marriage. What I didn't know then was this: leaving him would be the easy part. What came next would change everything. For months, I had rehearsed this moment in my head. I imagined myself walking out, closing the door, and never looking back. I imagined relief, freedom, a clean break. But standing there, I felt something else entirely. Clarity, not anger, not sadness, just clarity. Earlier that day, I had discovered what I already suspected, but had been too patient to confirm. A single email. Accidentally forwarded. Casual in tone. Intimate in implication. Written by someone who knew my husband far too well. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I didn't even reread it twice. Instead, I forwarded it to myself, closed the laptop, and went about my evening as usual. Dinner. Dishes. Polite conversation. I watched him laugh at something on his phone and wondered how long he'd been practicing that same expression for someone else. What startled me wasn't the betrayal, it was how calm I felt about it. I realized then that I had already left him emotionally. My body just hadn't caught up yet. As I turned away from the bedroom and walked down the hallway, my phone vibrated in my hand. A message. From someone I had not spoken to in years. Someone who, logically, should not have been involved in my marriage at all. The subject line read, "We need to talk. I know what's happening." I stopped walking. At that moment, I didn't know who had sent it, or how they could possibly know what I hadn't told anyone yet. But looking back now, I understand something clearly. That message wasn't an interruption. It was the beginning of the part of my story I never could have planned for. And it all started because I chose not to react. When people ask me now if there were signs early on, they expect a dramatic answer. There weren't any. Our marriage looked ordinary in the most comforting way. We met through mutual friends, bonded over shared routines, and built a life that functioned smoothly. No fireworks, no chaos, just consistency. And for a long time, that felt like enough. We divided responsibilities without arguing. He handled finances, I handled logistics. We had quiet evenings at home, predictable weekends, long conversations that slowly shortened as the years passed. There was laughter, of course, but it was softer now, quieter, like something we'd learned to contain rather than share. It wasn't unhappy. It was settled. I trusted him because he had never given me a reason not to. He wasn't secretive, he wasn't controlling, he wasn't unkind. To anyone looking from the outside, we were normal, solid, the kind of couple people admired quietly, without envy, because we seemed to have figured out the secret to a stable life. Which is why the betrayal, when it came, didn't feel explosive. It felt surgical, precise. As if someone had silently dismantled the foundation beneath me while I was busy thinking it was strong. Looking back, the distance crept in gradually. He became slightly more distracted, slightly more tired, slightly more busy. Subtle changes, minor irritations, the kind that could easily be written off as stress, overwork, or the natural ebb of years. Nothing suspicious enough to accuse, just enough to ignore. I remember once asking him if everything was okay. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said work had been stressful. He had this way of speaking that made concern feel like an overreaction. I believed him. Not because I was naive, but because trusting your spouse is not foolish, it's foundational. You want to believe. You have to. Our friends admired us for being stable, calm, low drama. I wore that label like a badge of honor, and yet that stability, that low drama reputation had a hidden cost. It masked the tiny fractures that were forming behind closed doors. Stability can disguise neglect. Neglect, when left unexamined, creates space. Space for other conversations, other connections, other lives. I didn't know then that someone else had quietly entered the space we had stopped protecting. Someone who was patient, unnoticed, and relentless. Someone who didn't need to shout or force their way in. They were already there, weaving themselves into the life I thought only I and my husband shared. What I did know, even in those early, subtle moments, was that something had shifted. And by the time I noticed it clearly, the world I thought I knew, my marriage, my safe harbor, was no longer what it seemed. He was already living in two worlds, and I had no idea which one I belonged to anymore. The first red flag wasn't a lipstick stain. It wasn't a late-night disappearance. It wasn't even a harsh word or a slammed door. It was a change in tone. He stopped asking questions. When I spoke, he listened, but his responses became generic. Polite. Delayed. Like someone multitasking while pretending not to. There was no malice, no confrontation, no obvious betrayal. Just a subtle shift that made me question myself. I'd catch him staring into space for a moment longer than usual, or giving a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. Our conversations lost weight. Words became lighter, less meaningful. Where there had once been curiosity and engagement, there was now a polite distance. One evening, I mentioned a major decision I was considering at work, something I had thought he would care about, or at least want to discuss. He nodded, smiled, and said, "That sounds good. Nothing else. No follow-up, no curiosity, no insight, just an empty affirmation." That night, I lay awake longer than usual, replaying the moment. My mind twisted possibilities, but none felt certain. Not suspicious, just unsettled. A creeping awareness that something in the rhythm of our life had shifted, yet I couldn't put my finger on it. Then came the phone habits. Not secrecy. Not hiding. Just distance. Small gestures that seemed trivial but were impossible to ignore once noticed. He would step outside to take calls, keep his phone angled slightly away from me, smile at messages he didn't share. Never intentionally dishonest, at least not in ways I could prove. But the warmth that had once been effortless now required effort to maintain. Still, nothing concrete, nothing I could accuse him of. I didn't want to become someone who searches for betrayal where there is none. That's a dangerous line to cross. Trust is not something to discard lightly. I had to believe in the life we had built, or I'd lose myself completely in suspicion. So, I waited. Waiting doesn't mean ignoring. Waiting means observing without interfering. Quietly, I began noticing patterns. Timing. Subtle shifts in behavior. The way his tone would change slightly when he returned from calls. The way he would laugh at jokes I couldn't hear. Little inconsistencies that seemed to whisper, "Something is different," but never shouted it outright. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Each moment of unease layered over the next. Each seemingly insignificant action became a piece of a puzzle I wasn't ready to solve. And then it happened. The truth didn't explode into my life. It didn't arrive with fanfare or confrontation. It slipped into the space between us, quiet and almost casual. A message accidentally seen. A comment overheard. Something so small, so ordinary, that at first I wanted to deny it, to convince myself it was nothing. But the denial didn't last. Not this time. The truth, when it finally surfaced, shattered the foundation I had trusted. And it all began with that subtle, almost invisible change in tone. The confirmation didn't arrive in the way movies prepare you for. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no message filled with hearts or promises or the kind of betrayal you can immediately pinpoint. It came quietly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, disguised as something so normal, I almost dismissed it. I was at the kitchen table, using my husband's laptop because mine had run out of battery. He had stepped outside to take a call, leaving the screen open. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't searching. I was replying to a routine email, something about a utility bill utterly mundane. Then a notification appeared at the top of the screen. Just a subject line. Nothing more. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't sexual. In fact, to an outsider, it might have looked completely harmless. But tone tells a story long before words do. The familiarity, the ease, the casual confidence, it was unmistakable. Comfortable in a way that only develops after repetition, after routine. This wasn't curiosity. This was continuation. I froze. I stared at the screen, expecting something. Anger, denial, panic. To rise in me, waiting for the internal script I'd rehearsed so many times in my head, waiting for the moment when my heart would pound or my hands would shake. None of it came. Instead, there was a slow, heavy realization settling in my chest. Not that he had betrayed me in a single impulsive moment, not that he had made one mistake, but that he had been living a second life, quietly, consistently parallel to mine, for longer than I wanted to know. I didn't open the message. I didn't scroll. I didn't dig for more. What I saw was already enough to confirm what my instincts had been whispering for months. I forwarded the email to myself, a quiet, deliberate act of proof for the moment when I'd need it. Then I closed the laptop. And I sat there, completely still. No tears, no shaking hands, no desperate urge to confront him, to demand answers, to erupt. What I felt instead was grief. Not for him. Not for the person I thought he was, but for the life I had believed I was living. For the marriage I had nurtured and trusted, now revealed as a carefully maintained illusion. He came back inside moments later, smiled like nothing had changed. Asked if I wanted tea. Mentioned traffic, the weather, something completely ordinary, completely harmless. I said yes. As I watched him walk into the kitchen, I understood something chilling. I wasn't thinking about confronting him. I was thinking about how to leave. How to leave without making a single mistake, without leaving a trace, without giving him a chance to spin the narrative, to manipulate, to claim innocence or confusion. My mind ran through possibilities. Every step, every word, every interaction had to be precise, calculated, silent, cliffhanger. At that moment, in the quiet of our perfectly ordinary kitchen, I realized something unsettling, something I hadn't understood before. Reacting emotionally would cost me far more than waiting ever could. Every tear, every shout, every dramatic gesture would play into his hands. And I wasn't ready to lose. This time, I would be the one controlling the story. The days that followed required a kind of discipline I didn't know I possessed. Every morning, I woke up next to a man who no longer felt like my husband. I listened to his voice. The cadence, the familiar tones that once comforted me now felt hollow. I watched the ease with which he moved between honesty and omission, like a tightrope walker balancing over a canyon. Observed how natural it was for him to inhabit two realities at once, one life with me, the other life that he carefully nurtured behind closed doors. And I said nothing. Silence is often mistaken for weakness. People assume it signals fear, indecision, or submission. But silence, when chosen deliberately, is a strategy. It is restraint. And restraint, when wielded carefully, creates clarity and advantage. I moved through our routine exactly as before. I cooked the meals he liked. I cleaned, organized, and maintained the house with the precision of habit. I asked about his day and listened politely when he spoke. On the surface, nothing changed. We could have been the same couple we always were. But underneath, everything had shifted. I began observing him, not obsessively, not out of paranoia, but methodically. I noted patterns that had always been there but never made sense until now. Work trips that always followed a particular rhythm. Calls taken outside the house, lasting just long enough to raise suspicion if you were paying attention. Financial movements that were minor but consistent, each one like a faint breadcrumb trail. I didn't dig through his phone in the dead of night. I didn't confront him or demand confessions. I let information surface on its own. Patterns have a way of revealing themselves when you stop interfering, when you step back and simply watch. At night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a single, haunting question. What is the smartest way to leave this marriage without losing more than I already have? I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't planning to humiliate him in public. I wanted something far more precise. Stability, control, and a clean exit that left me intact. Every move I made was calculated. Every gesture measured. Every interaction designed to preserve appearances while I quietly built my safety net. By the time he noticed my silence, by the time he wondered why I seemed distant and unshaken, I had already begun documenting everything that mattered. Emails, receipts, patterns, messages, times, places. Every detail that would tell the true story when the time came. He believed my quiet acceptance meant ignorance. That misunderstanding would cost him more than he ever imagined. Because while he was still living in a false sense of security, thinking he had time to manipulate and control, I was already assembling my exit. Every subtle observation, every careful note, every silent decision was moving me closer to a departure he couldn't see coming. And the moment I stepped forward, nothing would ever be the same. The decision to leave didn't arrive as a dramatic turning point. There was no cinematic moment where I looked at him and suddenly felt a surge of bravery or a rush of anger strong enough to walk out. No shouting match, no shattering revelation, no impulsive slam of the door. Instead, the decision formed quietly, almost imperceptibly, piece by piece, as I gathered information and carefully removed emotion from the equation. I tested the idea in private. I imagined my life without him, not in dreamy or romantic terms, but in cold, practical calculations. Where would I live? What would my expenses look like? Which legal obligations would remain? Which assumptions about our life together no longer held any truth? Each scenario I ran in my mind felt achievable. Each plan confirmed what my instincts already whispered. Staying indefinitely would cost me far more than leaving ever could. Yet I didn't rush. Impulse feels powerful, almost intoxicating, but it is expensive. One poorly timed confrontation, one misstep born of anger or fear, could destroy the careful foundation I had been building. I wasn't willing to sacrifice my future for the fleeting relief of exposing the betrayal immediately. Instead, I sought clarity. I asked questions, but carefully, without revealing my intentions. Hypothetical questions framed in ways that seemed casual, even innocuous. If someone had to start over, what would they need to consider? What precautions make sense if trust is broken? Each answer added a layer of protection, a blueprint for the path ahead. I learned that leaving when trust has been violated isn't just about walking away. It's about securing yourself first, ensuring that the other person has no leverage over you. The more I learned, the clearer my path became. Leaving impulsively would have left me vulnerable, scrambling, reacting. Leaving deliberately, strategically, would put me firmly back in control. That distinction mattered more than any dramatic declaration ever could. At home, nothing changed. We ate dinner at the same table, shared the same quiet routines. He complained about work, I nodded, gave minimal responses, maintained a calm, almost invisible presence. He mistook my silence for ignorance. I mistook his comfort as a sign that the timing was right. Every interaction became a calculated performance, every moment a rehearsal for the life I was about to reclaim. At night, alone with my thoughts, I stopped asking myself if I should leave. That question had already been answered. The only question left was when, and timing, I realized, was everything. Too soon, and I risked exposure and chaos. Too late, and I risked prolonging the damage to myself. The window for the perfect exit had to be precise, so I made the decision fully, privately, and without witnesses. I was leaving my marriage. He had no idea. Not yet. Cliffhanger. What he also didn't know was that once the decision had solidified in my mind, I had already entered the most critical phase of all. The phase where preparation meets opportunity, where strategy trumps emotion, and where the first visible move he would see would not be the start of my freedom, but the culmination of everything he thought he controlled. And when that moment came, nothing could undo it. Preparation is rarely visible from the outside. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't disrupt routines. In fact, it often looks like nothing at all. Like ordinary life, like mundane tasks, like someone simply being themselves. That's the brilliance of it. True preparation hides in plain sight, unnoticed until it is too late for anyone to intervene. While life at home continued exactly as it always had, I quietly began organizing everything that mattered. Not dramatically, not obsessively, methodically. Each move was small, calculated, and deliberate. Every piece of information, every document, every detail that could one day be critical was accounted for. Financial statements, shared agreements, passwords, personal identification. Things people rarely notice until it's too late. I made copies, stored them in safe locations, created redundancies. Nothing disappeared. Nothing was moved beyond recognition. Everything remained exactly where he expected it to be. That was intentional. I separated what needed to be separated without creating suspicion. I updated access where appropriate. I ensured I wouldn't be locked out of my own life the moment I chose to step away. I didn't make noise. I didn't leave a trace. It was a silent choreography, a game in which every move was invisible. Every step was small. Every step was deliberate. I didn't want him to feel threatened. I wanted him to feel comfortable. Comfort makes people careless. Carelessness, in turn, reveals everything. As the days passed, I noticed how truly unaware he was. He talked freely, made plans, assumed continuity. The future, he imagined, still included me, obedient, forgiving, and uninformed. He assumed I would remain exactly where I had always been, predictable, pliable, and blind to what was happening behind the scenes. And I let him believe that, not because I was afraid to correct him, but because I needed him exactly where he was. Naive, confident, and unsuspecting. There were moments when staying silent felt heavy. Moments when I longed to ask the questions I already knew the answers to. Moments when pretending became exhausting, when the weight of secrets pressed down on me. But each time I reminded myself, this isn't about endurance. This isn't about proving my strength or waiting for the perfect dramatic moment. This is about exit conditions. Every action, every delay, every unspoken observation was part of creating a path where I could leave intact, whole, and in control. By the time everything was in place, I felt a calm I had never known. Not relief. Readiness. I believed I was handling this alone, that the process would remain contained between me, my plans, and my patience. I thought I had anticipated everything. I thought I had prepared for every eventuality. Then, one evening, my phone vibrated with a message that changed the entire equation. A message from someone who should not have been involved at all. someone whose loyalty I had always assumed belonged firmly on his side. I froze. My breath caught. My fingers hovered over the screen. Cliffhanger. The sender's name stopped me cold, and what she knew would shift the balance of power permanently, revealing that the chessboard I thought I had mastered had another player, one who could change everything in an instant. The message came late in the evening, long after dinner had been cleared and the house had settled into its usual quiet. My phone vibrated once. I almost ignored it. I wasn't expecting anyone to contact me, and by that point, I had trained myself not to react impulsively. Every vibration had once triggered curiosity, even anxiety. But not anymore. I had learned restraint. Still, when I glanced at the screen, my breath caught. It was from my mother-in-law. For a moment, I wondered if it had been sent by mistake. We had always been cordial, respectful, but never close. She wasn't someone I confided in, and she certainly wasn't someone I expected to involve herself in my marriage. Her contact in that moment felt like stepping into a story I hadn't been prepared to read. The message was brief. We need to talk. I know what's happening. No accusations, no explanations, no questions, just certainty. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, my mind spinning through possibilities. How could she know? What had she seen? And more importantly, what did she want from me? I didn't respond immediately. Silence had served me well so far. Reacting too quickly could undo months of careful observation and planning. Then, a second message arrived, almost immediately. I'm not reaching out to defend him. That single sentence changed everything. It wasn't support for my husband. It wasn't interference. It was a declaration of neutrality, yet it held the weight of a potential ally. My mind raced. She knew, and she had made a choice. But which side of the fence would she occupy? We agreed to meet the next afternoon in a quiet cafe neither of us usually visited. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Her face was lined, her eyes heavier than I remembered. There was a tiredness there, the kind that comes from carrying secrets too long and knowing the truth about someone you thought you understood. She didn't smile. She didn't offer small talk. She simply sat, and in that quiet, I felt the first real shift in power since the betrayal had begun. I've known for a while, she said calmly, not the details, but the pattern. Her words landed gently yet firmly. She explained that she had noticed changes in him months ago. Excuses, unexplained absences, small contradictions he didn't realize were visible to someone who had known him his entire life. I hoped I was wrong, she said softly. But I wasn't. I listened without interrupting. There were no apologies for him, no attempts to minimize what he'd done. She didn't ask me to forgive. She didn't plead with me to stay. Instead, she leaned closer and said something I hadn't expected. I won't protect him from the consequences of his choices. For the first time, I felt the weight shift slightly off my shoulders. There was suddenly a new variable in play. Someone I had assumed would always align with him was offering clarity instead of collusion. Then she lowered her voice, her eyes sharp, almost conspiratorial. There are things you need to know, she said. Things he assumes you'll never find out. Cliffhanger. In that moment, I realized I hadn't been preparing alone after all, and the truth she was about to reveal would change everything I thought I knew about him and everything I had planned for the moment I walked away. What followed wasn't emotional reassurance. It was information. She spoke carefully, deliberately, each word measured. There was no gossip, no speculation, no dramatization. She wasn't venting. She wasn't offering comfort. She was recounting patterns she had seen, behaviors that had repeated over years in situations I could never have observed on my own. Each detail landed like a puzzle piece sliding into place, shaping a picture I hadn't realized was incomplete. This isn't new behavior, she said quietly. It's just the first time it's had real consequences. The weight of that statement pressed down slowly, making my chest tighten. I hadn't uncovered a single isolated mistake. I had uncovered a cycle. An entire system of decisions and behaviors designed to evade accountability, to preserve the illusion of stability, to quietly shift responsibility onto others while he continued unchallenged. She traced his past carefully. How he handled disagreements, how he avoided conflict, how, when cornered, he leaned on charm, delay, or selective silence until situations resolved themselves in his favor. She described the tiny, almost imperceptible signs, the ones I had dismissed in the past because they seemed mundane. A small inconsistency in a story, a habit of disappearing for no reason, patterns that, when viewed collectively, revealed intent. And they usually did, she added with a hint of bitterness, because no one prepared. Her words struck me harder than I expected. Preparation changes outcomes. Every step, every piece of information, every quiet act of observation mattered. Everything I had painstakingly documented over weeks wasn't just caution, it was leverage. She didn't offer to intervene. She didn't pressure me to act. She didn't try to control the narrative. Instead, she provided context history I couldn't access alone, clarity that reframed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. She empowered me to act with precision rather than emotion, to plan rather than react, to step into a position of strength without ever revealing it. By the time we left the cafe, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Leverage. Not dominance, not vindication, but clarity and control. For the first time, I realized the game had shifted. I was no longer reacting to his moves. I was anticipating them. I was no longer behind. I was not just surviving. I was preparing to dictate the terms of the end. That night, I didn't lie awake in anxiety. I didn't replay every hurtful word or imagined betrayal. I felt focused, precise. Every small adjustment mattered now. Timing, communication, access, observation. Nothing could be left to chance. Back at home, he remained completely unaware. He joked. He made plans. He spoke of us as if our future were still negotiable. Every detail of his ignorance only strengthened my position. He believed he was in control, but control had already slipped quietly from his hands. It was mine now, in ways he could not see or touch. Cliffhanger. And the moment I made my next move, the one that had been months in the making, there would be no way for him to regain it. Every assumption he held about us, about our future, would crumble quietly, irreversibly, and on my terms. The moment finally arrived. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but the air between us had shifted so much that even silence felt heavy. I had prepared for this confrontation not with anger, but with clarity. When he walked into the room, I could see it in his eyes, the realization that he no longer controlled the narrative. There was hesitation, the kind that comes only when someone senses they are standing on ground that isn't theirs. He started speaking, trying to frame his words carefully. "We need to talk about everything," he said. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. Every word he uttered was a thread he used to weave his version of the story. But I wasn't listening for stories. I was listening for openings. Every half-truth, every excuse, every attempt at charm became evidence of a man who had underestimated the consequences of his actions. I didn't need to argue because he had already done the work for me, exposing his own missteps in the process. When he paused, I finally spoke. My voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of someone who had crossed lines he couldn't undo. "I've known everything for weeks," I said. The silence that followed was deafening. He blinked, searching my expression for signs of uncertainty. but there were none. Only resolve. He stumbled over words, trying to regain footing, but his effort was futile. Every strategy he had relied on, charm, intimidation, manipulation, had been rendered powerless by preparation and patience. I didn't need to raise my voice or show anger. The realization that he had lost control entirely was more devastating than any confrontation could have been. He finally asked, almost whispering, "What are you going to do?" I paused, not because I was indecisive, but because the answer carried its own weight. "What needed to be done has already begun," I replied. And with that, I left the room. He understood in that moment that nothing he said or did could change the trajectory I had already set in motion, and the consequences were inevitable. The change in him wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable. At first, it appeared as confusion, a hesitation in his voice, a pause before answering questions he'd once responded to effortlessly. He began asking me about things he'd never shown interest in before: logistics, schedules, plans. It wasn't concern, it was calculation. He sensed that something had shifted, even if he couldn't yet identify what it was. The comfort he had relied on was no longer reliable. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked casually if everything was okay. The question came too late. I looked at him and answered honestly, without giving anything away. "I'm fine," I said. That was the truth. He wasn't. Over the next few days, his behavior changed further. He became quieter, more attentive. He attempted small gestures, conversations he'd previously avoided, suggestions of spending time together. Not reconciliation. Correction. He was trying to regain footing without knowing how much ground he had already lost. Eventually, he asked directly if I was upset about something. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't deny. I told him there would be time to talk, just not yet. That answer unsettled him more than any argument ever could have. For the first time since I had known him, he wasn't steering the situation. He was reacting to it. And reaction is always slower than preparation. He tried to make calls, asked questions of the wrong people, looked for reassurance where there was none. Each attempt confirmed the same truth. He was behind. He finally understood that whatever was happening wasn't something he could smooth over or delay. It was already moving. And when he eventually asked for a conversation he could no longer control, the balance between us had shifted permanently. The moment finally arrived. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but the air between us had shifted so much that even silence felt heavy. I had prepared for this confrontation not with anger, but with clarity. When he walked into the room, I could see it in his eyes, the realization that he no longer controlled the narrative. There was hesitation, the kind that comes only when someone senses they are standing on ground that isn't theirs. He started speaking, trying to frame his words carefully. "We need to talk. About everything," he said. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. Every word he uttered was a thread he used to weave his version of the story. But I wasn't listening for stories. I was listening for openings. Every half-truth, every excuse, every attempt at charm became evidence of a man who had underestimated the consequences of his actions. I didn't need to argue because he had already done the work for me, exposing his own missteps in the process. When he paused, I finally spoke. My voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of someone who had crossed lines he couldn't undo. "I've known everything for weeks," I said. The silence that followed was deafening. He blinked, searching my expression for signs of uncertainty, but there were none. Only resolve. He stumbled over words, trying to regain footing, but his effort was futile. Every strategy he had relied on, charm, intimidation, manipulation, had been rendered powerless by preparation and patience. I didn't need to raise my voice or show anger. The realization that he had lost control entirely was more devastating than any confrontation could have been. He finally asked, almost whispering, "What are you going to do?" I paused, not because I was indecisive, but because the answer carried its own weight. "What needed to be done has already begun," I replied. And with that, I left the room. He understood in that moment that nothing he said or did could change the trajectory I had already set in motion, and the consequences were inevitable. The days that followed were a mix of finality and quiet reflection. He tried to intervene in ways that were calculated and desperate. Calls, messages, small gestures meant to sway decisions. But the ground had shifted permanently. His actions had lost their influence. It was strange to watch. The man who once dictated the pace of our lives was now reacting, struggling to regain control where none existed. For me, there was relief. Not the relief of revenge, but the relief of reclaiming space and autonomy. Every decision, every calculated step had been mine, and for the first time in years, I felt free. Friends noticed the change in me, though I didn't need to explain. Confidence, calmness, a quiet strength. It radiated naturally now, unburdened by fear or doubt. He, on the other hand, faced the reality of consequences. Not just legal, but personal. Trust lost, respect diminished, and the understanding that his actions had created a permanent ripple that he could not reverse. There was no spectacle, no dramatic collapse. The resolution was quiet. Yes, Anga, I learned something in those weeks. Patience, planning, and clarity can outmatch chaos, lies, and manipulation every time. The strength of preparation outweighs the force of emotion. And in that calm, I realized something else. I hadn't just survived the betrayal. I had emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakably grounded. The story wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation, about ensuring that the last person I expected to intervene was no longer outside forces or luck. It was me, with resolve and strategy guiding every move. Sometimes, the most powerful intervention doesn't come from someone else. It comes from the moment you decide that nothing will stop you. Not lies, not manipulation, not even betrayal. And when that moment comes, everything changes. Even after reclaiming control, the story wasn't over. Late one night, as I sat reflecting on everything, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped, not out of fear, but anticipation. I wasn't expecting anyone. And yet, there they were. Someone I had underestimated completely. It wasn't a friend, a family member, or even a colleague. It was the very last person I imagined would step in. And the look on their face told me they carried power, influence, and a resolve of their own. "I know what you've been through," they said quietly, "and I'm here to make sure it's set right." In that instant, I realized the story wasn't just about betrayal or revenge. It was about alliances, timing, and the people you didn't realize were watching. Sometimes the ones you think are irrelevant are the ones who tip the scales completely. We talked long into the night. Plans, contingencies, and strategies unfolded. Every move I had made was now supported by someone whose presence changed the dynamic entirely. The betrayal that had once felt insurmountable suddenly seemed smaller, almost irrelevant, in the context of this unexpected intervention. The sense of relief was intoxicating, but it was not blind. I understood now that power often comes in subtle forms, in quiet interventions and unseen support. The next morning, the world seemed unchanged, but everything had shifted beneath the surface. What had been chaos before now moved according to a plan I had helped orchestrate, and the ally I hadn't expected had ensured it would stay that way. Who this person was and how they knew the right moment to intervene remained a mystery. one that would reveal its consequences only in the next and final part. The final confrontation didn't need fireworks. It was calculated, precise, and almost quiet, yet devastatingly effective. He faced the consequences, both personal and public, of everything he had done. Every lie, every betrayal, every attempt to manipulate had caught up to him. And in that reckoning, there was no room for excuses. But the true victory wasn't just seeing justice served. It was the knowledge that I had taken control at every step, anticipated moves, and used every resource wisely. And that unexpected ally? Their subtle support amplified the results, turning what could have been just a personal triumph into a complete resolution. In the aftermath, I didn't celebrate loudly. There was no need. Victory was felt in the quiet, and the sense of regained dignity and autonomy. Friends, family, and even strangers recognized the change in me. Confidence, calm, and a quiet strength replaced fear, doubt, and uncertainty. I learned something invaluable. Power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from preparation. Sometimes it comes from patience. And sometimes it comes from the people who appear when you least expect them, those who intervene not for drama, but to tip the balance toward justice and clarity. Looking back, every step, the anger, the plotting, the patience, the unexpected support, had been part of a larger story. And the lesson was simple but profound. Never underestimate your own resolve, and never underestimate the hidden forces around you. When the last person steps in, whether it's you or someone else entirely, everything changes. And in that moment, you realize the only thing that truly matters is that you never gave up, never lost focus, and never let betrayal define you. You need to add some text for me to talk.